What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamoda and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. Man, time moves fast, doesn't it?
Seriously fast. I feel like a couple of days ago we were like, I think in 90 days the Taliban will take over Kabul. Jesus Christ. They were playing bumper cars by like the next day, like after we were finished recording.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, I don't remember when we said what, but a couple of weeks ago, I think we said like 90 days or so. Mm-hmm. I don't know what consensus we came to. That's what I figured, around 90 days, 4 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. I think last time we spoke about Afghanistan, I think last episode, I don't really remember what I said. I think I said it might take a while for them to take the urban centers, but they did very quickly. But, you know, someone reached out to me on Twitter today, and it made me feel good about myself because he's like, hey, I just listened to that episode on Vietnam, and you said that once the U.S. leaves Afghanistan, then the government will fall in 3 hours. And I was like, I said that? Okay, I'll take that. So,
well, that's funny. I mean, that's interesting that you bring that up because I definitely want to talk a little bit more about Vietnam today, but we'll do that at the end.
Okay. But, I mean, here's the thing. The media is going crazy right now, and I think it's diluting the narrative that we should be taking from this very, very valuable lesson that we're all receiving about nation building and foreign policy and statecraft and intervention. Just so many valuable lessons should be learned right now. Mm-hmm. And, you know, everyone is using this politically. So the right wing is saying, Biden, such a disaster. He ruined everything. And then the Democrats are like, well, this is all Trump's fault. You know, so
meanwhile, George Bush is sitting back like with a smile on his face and his hands up in the air.
It's kind of hilarious because really no one's blaming either George Bush for starting this and Obama for extending it and making it even bigger.
Or even going back before that, like fucking Ronald Reagan for his involvement in the history. That's even further back.
Let's not expect too much from our media. Of course, we're not going to go all the way there. There might be some special, on ABC that talks about it for 2 minutes.
Yeah,
but it will never ever be kind of drilled into the minds of the American news watcher. But all right, everyone knows it looked like a disaster. So people,
I mean, it is a disaster. Let's be real, it is.
Well, all right,
but it's just the probably the least disaster.
I want you to hear me out right now because I think that this may have been the best case scenario, what we just watched.
I disagree, but go ahead. I'll entertain this.
What would you rather have? Would you rather have a peaceful, pretty much bloodless war? Yeah, there have been casualties and there have been murders, but usually those murders have been, the Taliban murders have been more like specialty, pilots have been killed and stuff, and military commanders. Those guys have been being assassinated and stuff like that. But other than that, it's just been going from village to village. Hey, you declare, are you a brother of Allah? And, do you agree not to fight us? Yes. Okay. We're fine. That's kind of been what's been going on in the countryside. And then that just extended to Kabul. And it was bloodless. Would you rather have a sacking of the city? Would you rather have a 6-month sacking of Kabul and there be mass civilian death? Would you rather be mortars and the Taliban running in and machine gunning people and killing just men, women, and children? And it's funny because that's how the media is reacting. They're reacting as if the Taliban is going in like ISIS did Western Iraq and started committing atrocities. And based off what I've seen, I mean, maybe there are some things going on, but based off what I've seen, they're kind of just saying, all right, guys, we're in charge here. We're just going to keep the status quo. Just go back to your business. We're bringing law and order, law and order. They keep on saying law, order, peace, law, order, peace. So the fact that there was a transition of power that wasn't a complete bloodbath, I think is a positive development in the story, rather than be some brutal battle that goes on that just takes the lives of countless people. And it's not even like American soldiers or Americans are like stuck, trapped in the embassy and trying to escape out of the country. The Taliban is saying, they're being kind of nice about it so far, as nice as they can be. I don't want to sound like a Taliban apologist, because they are bastards and they do have no problem really killing civilians. But right now they seem to be diplomatic about everything. They're saying the right things and they're behaving in the right ways, where they're not trying to test the Americans to go back in and say, all right, we're just going to carpet bomb. We're going to leave, but we're just going to carpet bomb this place, because they know that is a possibility. Mm-hmm. But no, I think largely this is a good thing for, at the very least, the Afghan people. Maybe not Afghan women, but for the people who immediately live in Kabul. It's better not to die in an explosion. So that's my initial take. What is your take?
Hey, look, I mean, I mostly agree with everything you're saying, right? As a matter of fact, the majority of what you say I agree with. I would definitely prefer a bloodless takeover, even by, bastards like the Taliban. Where I think it's not the best case scenario, and, to not to spew a talking point from the right here, but, I think it was a mistake of us to telegraph the fact that we were leaving and the date upon which we were leaving, and then continuously broadcast those things. I think what would have been a better situation would have been maybe to admit that we were leaving and to internally have that date set, and to proceed with those motions. But right now, the U.S. and allies and people like that have no leverage to impart upon the Taliban to try and, make a seamless transition of government, right? So right now what we're seeing, is just it's the first of many steps, of a, basically what is a reunification of a country that's been at a civil war for fucking at least 20 years, more if we really look into the history. Right now, all we're seeing is that first step. And, I will talk about Vietnam later, but there's a lot of echoes there that need to be considered. And the fact that we, the former occupying force, have no leverage over it is troubling in that one respect. And it's the most troubling for the people of Afghanistan, as you say, just like the women, as an example. And furthermore, while we don't have American soldiers stuck in Afghanistan that can't leave, there are still thousands upon thousands of people who have legitimate reasons to fear for their lives in a Taliban rule when the United States is fully out, when we are done with our operations. And I think had we been more covert about our process of leaving, I think we would have been able to secure the airport much better. And I think we would have been able to get out more of the Afghanistan, the Afghanis who supported us, who helped us, in the last 20 years, and people who would be considered dissidents, help out with what is going to be invariably a refugee crisis. This is definitely going to happen, and that's going to cause regional instability. I know that the people around Afghanistan, namely Pakistan, is going to have some trouble, with this new government, if at the very least for the refugee problem, but more so for, the instability that refugee crises create. So is this the best case scenario? No, in my opinion. I think hindsight being 2020, there could have been better organization and better operation of this withdrawal. I definitely support the withdrawal. I definitely think it's about time. I'm sure we'll probably talk about Biden's speech and the media's reaction about it, but I'll leave that for later. But there's still so much more that has to happen after. This is just step one. Step one is Taliban takes over Kabul. But there's still so much more that has to happen after that, and there's still so much more that can go devastatingly wrong.
Well, I mean, we're talking about the Boondocks. We're talking about a place that is basically Tatooine in Star Wars. Like, we're talking about a place so alien and foreign to anyone else in America that we have no idea how their customs are, how people really interact with each other. It's just a foreign, exotic place to Americans where we should not project our values on. Now, I think where I'll agree with you as far as like the withdrawal. I mean, I think the best thing they could have done was they should have stuck with the original plan, Trump's plan, to move out in May. Because what they did is that they withdrew during fighting season. Mm-hmm. And withdrawing from fighting season, the Afghan army was completely demoralized, basically evaporated. It evaporated as soon as the Americans left. Mm-hmm. Like, it literally the army evaporated in a matter of hours from when the U.S. finally left. It was astonishing to see just how much of a ghost army they actually were. We all knew that this was a ghost army. This wasn't a real thing. Most of the soldiers were fake soldiers.
Did you see the videos that have been circulating that went viral on how like the American soldiers like trying to teach a bunch of Afghani soldiers how to do jumping jacks? That shit was hilarious. But I mean, obviously this is like one isolated incident, but I think it's kind of a meme. It's definitely a meme, but it's also like a representation of this ghost army that you're talking about, right? This is like totally ill-equipped, totally unserious, military.
When I say ghost army, I mean they're physically not really in the army. They're just on the army.
Well, yeah, they inflated their numbers. They inflated their numbers just to get more money and weapons and shit like that. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, we're talking about lying about how big the army is, when in reality, it's probably a third of the size that they're saying is. And it's funny, one of Biden's big mistakes, and something I wish he was transparent on. I think he probably knows enough to know that, everything that he said prior in July about the Afghan army being able to, at least stand up to the Taliban was not really speaking in terms of reality. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to sit here and, trash Biden on this because everyone else is trashing him, including the corporate press, which is kind of astonishing how hard the corporate press is going after him on. But he's ending the war. He's under immense political pressure to change his tune right now. He's getting attacked from everyone, from the right to the neoliberal left. He's getting attacked from all sides about staying there. The right is saying, "Oh, you are ruining American credibility. Blah, 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 blah. How are we ever supposed to negotiate, or any other country supposed to take us ever serious again? This is embarrassing. A stain our national pride." Blah. And then you hear people on the left are like, "Afghan women. Oh no, Afghan women. You can't." Biden's like, "No, it's done. It's over. We're leaving. Like, there's no point to do this anymore." His mistake was misleading people in July, saying that this was going to be a fight. But then again, that could have just been in his briefings telling him that, maybe he's done.
Well, yeah,
I'm not sure how much
he should probably sack that national security advisor.
Well, someone needs to get fired over this. There needs to be a scapegoat. And just the optics. And I don't know. I get a little bit of a sense of, I'm not sure about this yet, and I'm purely speculating. I have no proof. I do have a little bit of a babies on incubators vibe on this, that there's some imagery that could be exaggerated. I'm not really sure about that, but I really get that kind of babies on incubators type vibe.
About
some of the stories that are coming out, trying to over dramatize some things. Like, watching that video of the people on the tarmac hanging onto the planes, I was like, why the hell are you doing that? Why are you hanging on to these planes?
Yeah, but I mean, that happened. That
definitely happened. But I'm just wondering. I'm just like it's a stunning video because, like, what do they expect to happen? Like the guy held on to that plane and he dropped 100 feet, and I think he died.
Yeah, he did. There was another one that got squished by the landing gear and got stuck in the landing gear. And outside of the window, there's this video in the C-130 of like just his dead corpse flailing around in the wind because dude is dead. And this is why I'm saying, Henry, that I don't think that this is the best case scenario, because there were people, at least through the evidence that we see, who were so fucking desperate to leave that they were willing to risk their lives, and many died, to hang on to the side of a fucking plane. As ridiculous an idea as that sounds, there were people that were that desperate. And for that reason, I can probably agree with you on they should have probably pulled out in non-fighting time, not during fighting season, because in that respect, they would have been able to secure the airfields better, and maybe they would have been able to get more people out in a more orderly fashion, you know? So in that respect, there is things that could have been done better. I agree with the, you know, overall sentiment that like we're pulling out and we don't have anything to do with this anymore. But, you know, the empathy in me cannot get beyond the idea of how bad it's going to be for these people. And I'm not saying that justifies staying, but I cannot remove myself from feeling for the people of Afghanistan, and especially not after some of the research that I did on Vietnam, which we'll talk about a little later, because as we'll see when we discuss that, again, I mentioned that this is just step one of many, and shit got really bad for a lot of people in Vietnam, and the parallels to the Taliban taking over Afghanistan are just very clear. So, and my final point on this, and we can move on and maybe we can talk about some of the, you know, the history behind this. My final point here is that while we might not have the responsibility to give a shit about Afghanistan anymore because we're pulling out, and while we might have that luxury, unfortunately, there will be, in my opinion, regional instability due to refugee crises. There's also the bit about how the Pashtuns, you know, a good amount of Pashtuns are actually located in Pakistan. And Pakistan isn't doing very well economically. I just watched a video with their president and how they cannot support additional refugees, not after everything that they've been going through, especially with coronavirus and such like that. And we got to remember, the fucking Pakistanis have nukes, right? So there could be serious conflict, and while that might not directly affect us as Americans, it will almost invariably affect us in one way or another, and it could escalate into something that we can't ignore anymore.
Of course, I think that American collaborators should be harbored to safety after putting themselves on the line. If they're in danger, they should be harbored to safety. And you know, I'm supportive of refugee. I've heard right wingers say stuff like, "Oh man, if you're not willing to die for your country, then you should just stay there and die." You know, like, you know, we don't want you if you are not a man enough. So I've heard stuff like that. No, I understand why you want to get out of there. But let's not act like the Afghan society is some, you know, the Shire and the Hobbit being taken over by orcs. You know, it's basically an extremely corrupt cesspool of a government that is extremely oppressive anyway. So for a lot of people, it's going to be, what difference does it make? And, you know, this isn't the first time that the U.S. has dropped one of their client states. You know, you can go back right after World War II. Chiang Kai-shek's government in 1949, China, South Vietnam, obviously, Batista in Cuba, Somoza in Nicaragua. These are all cases of, you know, the collapsing regime that had at the very least been aided massively with U.S. military equipment, and most of the time with trainers. And in some of those countries, the U.S. actively participated in those battles,
right?
And especially in the case in South Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
In every one of these cases, the regime was unable to survive a military offensive by the insurgent forces without active U.S. participation.
That's correct.
So the Afghan army didn't just surrender. They just switched sides. And that seems to be kind of a reoccurring theme in Afghan society. The withdrawal in Kabul, and I just want to make this one more point, and then let's go into the history of the Taliban and how they grew from the 90s on. But the person to blame is George Bush. I don't think Trump or Biden deserve the blame on this. I think they should both be praised on this for their role. They should be thanking each other for their roles in this, even though they won't thank each other or praise each other. Of course not. But for Trump for starting the withdrawal, and for Biden for executing it. I am not a expert on military logistics to tell someone how that withdrawal should have gone or what was the best way to do that. That's not really my expertise. Obviously, it didn't look pretty, but at least it happened. And relatively, there wasn't a huge cost of life in the process. The blame lies with George W. Bush, who let Osama bin Laden get away at Tora Bora. I think on purpose to expand his terror war.
Definitely on purpose.
And to expand his war to Iraq. It was Bush who decided to build a phony state and an Afghan national army of northern Tajik, Uzbek, and Hazara tribes against the Pashtun populations. And it was Obama who sent 70,000 more troops in the surge.
Right. That's
getting
right.
another 1,000 Americans killed. And who knows how many Afghans killed? In effect, driving more people into the insurgency.
Right.
And it was the U.S. national security establishment who completely sold the American people on a fake bill of goods. They lied repeatedly about the status of the war. They lied repeatedly about the progress of the Afghan National Army. They lied repeatedly about, the progress of the actual state itself. They repeatedly lied about everything, the national security establishment. And this was a failed project from the doom. And I wasn't alive during Vietnam, but it's unbelievable that we could try a project like that again and get away with it. Like, I thought that in West Point, you studied the Vietnam War a lot.
Yeah.
Because that was a failure. Like, how many big-time generals have their, theses and stuff, or, they write books on the Vietnam War. Like, H.R. McMaster wrote his thesis on the Vietnam War and how they could have won. How do you not learn these lessons? But I think you need to understand the reoccurring themes in Afghanistan, and you have to understand some structural features that make Afghanistan the way it is, and that's how you could really understand the ascent of power of the Taliban. The geography, I think most people who listen to this know, it's very rugged, it's very mountainous, it's a very poor place, it's landlocked, it has a social system of intense local loyalty. Thus, it has always had a very weak central state, if there's a central state at all.
Right.
A recurring theme in Afghanistan is that outsiders repeatedly intervene in the country. So the British did this, the Soviets did this, the United States did this, all for their own geopolitical reasons, or the political reasons of the people in power. And what were the results of these occupations?
It was not great.
They weren't great. They were all able to pacify the urban population centers, but then found the countryside inhospitable. And they left. They all withdrew. And after they withdrew, internal conflicts escalate until some new group establishes order, which often offends, external actors again, who then intervene.
Right.
And this cycle just goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. That is kind of the major themes, or the cycle of life for Afghanistan. And Afghanistan has been in a perpetual state of war since 1978. So at this point, we're going well over 40 years of war, which in turn has created a war-like culture. This
It's a whole generation of people.
For most people, that all you know is war.
That's
you had never been born, and not war like as in a lot of Americans now or young Americans now who are born after 9/11. They've only been living through technically wartime, but we're not being
It's not
drone
war
striked.
here. Yeah, it's war somewhere else.
Yeah, it's war somewhere else. A place in like very foreign, exotic lands that we can't really even imagine.
Or point out on a map
I mean?
in a lot of times.
Like the people that we're fighting, they seem like they're from Star Wars. They really do. Like when you look at people from the Taliban, they look like they came from a time machine. Like it's hard to understand it, seeing in like this real powerful imagery that is coming out of like the presidential palace of like the Taliban on the gym equipment and stuff. Did you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Like they're like fucking around in the gym and they're on swing sets and now they're playing go-kart. It's like it's very weird imagery. It's like, you found somebody from the 17th century, you put them in a time machine and then you took them to an amusement park. That's what it looks like. It just looks odd. This current cycle of violence that we're in, it all started in April of 1978 when the Afghan Communist Party seized power in a military coup and assassinated President Mohammed Daoud. And, the communist government forged close ties with the Soviet Union, and they launched a really ruthless purge all across the country. And these land and social reforms that were implemented, they were bitterly resented by the countryside, and they sparked insurgency movements. So the following year, the Soviet Union invades, and they actually topple the current communist president, and they put their own guy in, and their goal was to prop up the successor regime, and this is what prompts a Cold War escalation within the resistance. So Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, and so did Robert Gates, they famously say, we now have the opportunity to give the USSR its own Vietnam War, meaning that they now have the opportunity to drag the Soviet Union into a quagmire and bleed them dry. Just get them bogged down, make them lose morale through losing soldiers and wasting finances and just being in this totally weird kind of corrupt project that makes really no sense to anyone outside of your circle, like the Vietnam War was. The U.S., along with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, started supporting multinational insurgent forces known as the Mujahideen. And the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan made the U.S. invasion look like child's play. They invaded with 500,000 soldiers and they killed about 1 million Afghans. We know that this invasion became a disaster for the Soviets. They withdraw in 1989, and the Marxist regime that they propped up, they lost support, and they finally were forced to step down, and they had that hand power over the Mujahideen. But here's what happened: the resistance groups that fought the Soviet troops and defeated the Soviet-backed government in Kabul, they all turned on each other. And after the Soviets withdrew, the aid spigots to the Mujahideen started to dry up from the United States, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and there was a whole bunch of other countries who were funding this as well. We've done bunch of episodes on this in more detail about the actual process of how the United States and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan were working together to fund these. So I would encourage you to listen to those. Once those aid spigots dried up, these warlords, they deepened their involvement in the narcotics trade. Something that is almost synonymous with Afghanistan is opium.
Mm-hmm. Them poppy seeds.
Poppy seeds. There's you ever seen the movie War Machine?
Yeah.
Very funny movie based off Stanley McChrystal.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many really funny parts in that. The part where the guy's like, he's explaining to, what's the name? General, what's the fake name they give him? It's not General McChrystal. They give him a fake name.
I don't recall off the top of my head.
Well, they're like, they keep on calling us motherfucker, and in all culture, it's not good to fuck. And he's like, ours too. But there's a scene where he's like, this is heroin. He's like, can we try maybe growing wheat or something or sugar? He's like, no, it's like due to protective tariffs in the United States, no foreign, we cannot give aid. It's just like, he's like, all right, it's a really funny scene.
Yeah. Also, all that shit is set up by the CIA anyway, so.
Yeah, I know. It's all black. It's all, black budget. More than half of Afghanistan's provinces, they have 28 provinces, they cultivate poppy. Or at least they were cultivating poppy. I don't know now. But they were cultivating poppy in the 80s. Well, they still do. I'm just saying in the 80s, a lot of the provinces were cultivating poppy. And they were producing 250 metric tons of opium annually for export.
That's nuts.
So during the war of resistance to the Soviet Union, Pashtun trucking networks were capitalizing on the transporting of arms to the fighters. But at the same time, they were also profiting off the drug trade. They're called the trucking mafia,
right?
Which they became really big power players at the time.
Hey, I mean, it's hard to move shit around in Afghanistan. Like you said, it's rugged, mountainous terrain. Those like areas are hard to navigate, and there was a market need for transportation in general. So it obviously makes sense that they would capitalize on it, and that people would be making money, and that they would be doing the transportation activities that would yield them the most money. Like, they're not going to be moving fucking food around. They're not going to make that much money on that. They're going to move drugs and guns around. That's what makes money. High risk, high reward. That's what it is.
Well, listen, man, the political economy of Afghanistan is just not really there. It's just too isolated. It's too far from things.
Right.
They don't have the ability, the industry level to mine their minerals, to mine, the raw materials that they have. The only thing they really can do, and this is common with countries that are in intense poverty, is grow crops. And I mean, it's not, you don't really make much money growing cotton or stuff like that. It's
exactly. So if you're going to grow something, you might as well grow some drugs.
Unless you're, especially if you're they don't even have the ability to mass produce agriculture like we do in America, and an industrialized country where we perfected agriculture and farming. They grow opium because it's you can sell it for more money. You sell it on the black market. Like, why? What you should? There's a totally big incentive of growing and selling opium. But yeah, there's no ports. There's nothing really being made in Afghanistan. They don't even have. They never went through that kind of industrialization process that the Arab world went through. After the World War II, because they never had a real government there. They never. I'm not saying the government is the reason why the industrialization happens, but they just never. They're just removed from even the concept of a modern market economy. They're just so far from that. The majority of the society in the mountains and the valleys, where they speak different dialects in every single town. You know what I mean?
Seriously.
But, to go back to the trucking mafia, so these new transporting elites started emerging, and they would collaborate with the Pakistani government to truck weapons to the Afghan rebels while also running these multi-million-dollar heroin empires. And, warlords within the Mujahideen groups, they were also involved in the narcotics trade. For example, there's a handful of really famous, there's so many warlords, but there's a handful of really famous ones that, that are kind of featured in every single book. There's one named Nassim Akuandada. I can't really pronounce it, but he enforced opium production quotas for poppy farmers in the Helmand Valley, and even like their very pious Muslim warlords like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Yunus Khalis were operating heroin labs. And, these warlords would get into turf wars just like the Black Disciples and the Vice Lords do in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
They were just criminal rackets that were fighting each other.
Right. And everybody's in on it.
Yeah. So, even with the removal of the Soviet-backed government, things didn't get better. What happened is that it turned into a chaotic anarchy. Not a ANCAP society, a chaotic anarchy with just no rules or laws
just
or boundaries.
Straight up anarchy, I think works.
So, these rival Mujahideen factions started fighting each other, and it just created this very highly unstable environment. And, the violence created a high-risk environment for the transit industry. So, they were having checkpoints. So, they would, basically what they would do is that they would just create checkpoints everywhere, these different warlords. So they'd see a truck, they'd stop the truck, they'd say, give me money. If they didn't give them the money, they would kill them and driver and take their shit. That was basically what was going on within, if you were a trucker, it was life or death going out into the road. So this prompted a coalition of, trucking firms and drug traffickers, because this is bad for business too. All these people killing each other.
Right.
Religious leaders and Pakistani intelligence to foster the emergence of the Taliban. Taliban in Arabic means students. And, they were founded in 1994, about halfway through the civil war that ensued after the Soviets withdrew, by Mullah Omar, probably the most famous member of the Taliban who has since died. But Omar was, very different from the other Mujahideen, the other leader, like warlords in the country. They all came from more wealthy societies, like more wealthy, I think, like parents, like the kids of like engineers and stuff, like upper class people, and relative to Afghan society. And Mullah Omar was poor. He was like a poor Pashtun, and he had got his military training from the Pakistani intelligence, which was, getting funded from the U.S. to train and equip fighters headed for Afghanistan. And, what they were doing is that, there was these young, traumatized fighters who were plucked out of Pakistani refugee camps. A lot of them had actually, after the war, the Soviet invasion, they even went back to their madrasas to finish their Islamic education. And they were not happy with the current state of the Mujahideen. I can't even pronounce it. Mujahideen.
Is it Mujahideen or Mujahideen?
Mujahideen. I know, I'm just horrible with speech and language sometimes. When I speak too much without a breath. When I speak too much without taking a breath. But when the Taliban, first arrived to southern Afghanistan, around November of 1994, their ideology, it fell on fertile soil. Their platform was kind of like the Republican platform, last election. Law and order, law and order.
Right.
Law and order, peace and law and order. That was their platform. Kind of what their platform is right now. Because like what the Taliban is doing right now, their public relations team is just saying, hey, everyone, just continue what you're doing. Law and order. We're bringing peace, law and order. Peace, law and order. It's like something common if you're paying attention to what they're saying. Just keep on, go to school. If you have a job, just go back to your job. If you're in school, just go to school. Just act like nothing's happening. We'll patrol the streets, law and order, law and order. That's like what they're saying. Kind of a throwback. You know what I mean?
Well, this is all these people know. And
yeah.
I have some points of criticism about what, how that's going to play out. But we'll get to that later.
Well, yeah, I can certainly see how this is going to be unstable as well, and I certainly don't think that the Taliban are going to, bring Afghanistan into the 21st century at all. We're talking about the Taliban; they're brutal bastards. Let's just be real. But I'm just saying there are reasons that a entity like the Taliban becomes popular enough where effectively the entire Pashtun plurality of the country, kind of just jumps to their side as soon as they start showing any type of momentum in the insurgency. Mm-hmm. I think there is a reason why they pick up popularity, and it has to do, with these reasons that are mainly geographical and have to do with the unstable history. Why something like peace and law and order is a very attractive campaign slogan. I mean, peace and law and order is how so many Republicans were able to get into Congress last election cycle. There was supposed to be a larger defeat of Republicans from Democrats, and the Democrats got a lot of shit for a lot of protests and riots that went on the summer before. And that's how a lot of Republicans got into office.
That's what they campaigned on, right?
That's what they campaigned on. There's footage, and I'm not trying to say what's right or wrong about that. You can think whatever you want about, the George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter protests and things like that. But I'm just saying that Republican strategists were able to capitalize on the imagery of looting and riots and things like that. And there's a tape recording of or a phone call that was recorded by, I think, a Democratic congresswoman, I think from Virginia or North Carolina, screaming at other congresspeople saying, "If you say defund the police one more time, we're going to lose everyone." It's an effective platform in times of instability. So that's what we're doing now. More than 15 years into the war in Afghanistan, so the new government was extremely corrupt, and the whole country was in reality divided among these various warlords, like Hizb Islami by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Jamaat Islami, and I'm not going to go through all of them because there's so many of them. But there's something, the Taliban reestablished a semblance of order. In this case, a world where you can send your kid out to grab some food and expect him to return and not be raped in the process. It turns out people prefer that not to happen. So it's not surprising in the Pashtun areas people started supporting the Taliban. And I don't know if you've ever heard this phrase before. I've heard it, and I forget where I've read it, but I've seen it, I've heard it, and I've read it in more than one place. Rape culture. Have you ever heard that phrase? Rape culture? Well, it's been a term to describe segments of Afghan society. Segments of Afghan society have something called a rape culture, which sounds quite horrible. I think anyone would agree. For example, I mean, if you just read some of the stories that come out of our own war there over the past 20 years, there's many really disturbing stories about Afghan police, Afghan army, Afghan officials, high up Afghan warlords abusing children systemically, and it's quite gross. For example, a couple of U.S. Marines were murdered in an insider attack. An insider attack is basically when a guy that you're training takes the gun and kills you, betrays you and kills you. It's an inside assassination. So someone in the Afghan recruit takes the gun, walks into a barracks, and just starts shooting people up. Well, this recruit did this to I think 3 Marines while they were working out in the gym, and the reason why the reason why he did it was because his abuser was promoted to police chief or something like that.
So the guy who raped him.
Yeah, so the guy who raped him, he was a sex slave to this man, and he had been promoted to police chief. And as revenge for that, he decided to murder some Marines, which is obviously
who promoted
wrong as well.
him to police chief? Was it the U.S. or
it was
the
just
government?
The system. I'll send you the story, but if you just type it in, there's a whole story about how there was a cover-up on this, and this guy was a sex slave to this high Afghan police officer, and he had been promoted, and he had turned a gun on American soldiers. It's a really sad story. Obviously for the life lost and for the sexual abuse that was taken, and just for everything. It's a horrible story.
Yeah, none of that sounds good.
In fact, U.S. soldiers were told explicitly I'm not saying everyone, but there were American soldiers who were explicitly told to ignore child sexual abuse. And you can read about this everywhere. You can read about this in the New York Times. You can read about this in main presses. These are stories that got out where soldiers were said to look the other way, if your Afghan comrades were preying on children.
It's fucked up. And
there's a famous case of a Green Beret getting court-martialed for beating up a child molester. This guy, he beat the shit out of him, and he got in trouble because he went against orders.
He deserved it.
Which I think outside in, you're just like, yeah, what the fuck? Why is this guy being court-martialed? Like, this guy just did the right thing. Like, how could you even take that? But the story goes on. There's like this anecdotal story. I'm not sure if it's true or not. It sounds true, and for the purpose of the point I'm trying to make, I'll just say it is true. There was this notorious Mujahideen commander who specialized in raping children. And when the Taliban came, they said this is going to stop. And they hung him from the barrel of a tank.
Whoa.
This was how they restored order. They like to hang people from, construction cranes or, high things where they can publicly show, hey, we just came into town. We took people who are violating Islamic law, and we just hung them in front of you. And this is the message that if you are violating law in our terms of order, we're going to kill you. Like, we're going to put you out in the middle of this public square, and we're going to hang you. And, I think what's conflated, people, one of the ways that we were sold on the war in Afghanistan is that we were kind of told that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were the same thing. When I was in 7th grade, or when I was 11 years old when 9/11 happened, it was I didn't know the difference at all. I couldn't tell you the difference between. I thought they were the same group. I used to think it was another name. I used to think that the Taliban was just another name for Al-Qaeda, but they were the exact same group. I had no idea that these were different countries and different regions and different. I was like, oh,
fucking politicians still get this wrong today.
Yeah. When Tim Ryan said that, I know. I'm just saying that it's very easy to conflate, two groups of people together because they both wear exotic hats. Because what was our exposure to Middle Eastern or the greater or Central Asian societies 20 years ago?
Indiana Jones at best.
Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
Indeed. Bad date.
Right.
Indeed.
That's all we got.
The fat guy in Indiana Jones. I'm gonna take a sip of water. So, if you could pontificate.
Yeah. obviously the conflation of the two was pretty easy to make. I freely admit I also had no idea what the difference was, because that's how we were told. That's how we were taught. Even the
you're half Arab and you didn't know the difference.
No, of course I didn't. They were they basically didn't make any. If I remember correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but when you would watch the media, they would just kind of use those two words somewhat interchangeably, or they would blanket all the people in that region, even though they're two completely separate countries, like very far away from one another, as just straight quote terrorists, right? Like we weren't thinking of them even in terms of what their names were. We were dehumanizing them even further by just giving them a derogatory term, terrorist. They're just terrorists, right? It's kind of like a Team America World Police, where everybody's just every brown person in the greater Middle East and Central Asia is just a terrorist, right? It didn't matter where they were, what like group that they were from. They're just terrorists, terrorist. It's just so we weren't taught that there were different types of terrorists, right? Or that there were different types of groups there of varying degrees of, terrorism. All we were just they're enemy combatants. That was another word that we used, a less dirty word, but, still generalized term, enemy combatants. They're just, all of them are enemy combatants.
I used to feel, real guilty for this, but I don't kick myself anymore for this anymore, because, a lot of, when you're younger and you're propagandized, it's not your fault for you getting the wrong impressions. Adults are the ones who are thinking of this propaganda.
Right.
So there's no need, I think, to feel guilty if, if you're around the same age, if you're in your, late 20s or early 30s and you were really fooled by this stuff, because even adults were fooled by this stuff, and, people were actively trying to manipulate the population to sell to support this war. But something I remember watching videos of, like counterinsurgencies, like airstrikes, like with their heat goggles, like shooting down guys running around, like Taliban running around in the mountains. And I used to be like, oh, awesome, yeah,
we got him,
yeah, got him. And I'm like, now, like looking back in the context, like, well, I mean, if someone invaded my country, I think I'd be doing that too. Like,
right. And not only that, but some number of them, some large number of them, had nothing to do with anything, and they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they just got gunned down for no good reason. Kind of like those videos that came out, in the WikiLeaks drops that we talked about a couple of episodes ago on our episode of Julian Assange.
Yeah, and if I saw that without like someone to explain to me what was going on. When I was younger, I would have been like, oh yeah, those were all terrorists. Wouldn't have questioned it. But someone had to explain, like I had to read with multiple sources and kind of have it hammered in my head, like, hey, those were civilians who were just murdered for no reason at all.
And they're laughing about it too.
And they were laughing at it. And those were journalists employed by a major, not Al Jazeera, the evil Muslim news network that propagandizes us and writes stories on Peyton Manning trying to destroy our sports heroes. They were the ones who broke the Peyton Manning HTH story.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is quite funny. I remember thinking that. I was like, oh, Al Jazeera, they're attacking our sports heroes now. they do 9/11, then now they attack our sports heroes. Ah!
Right.
I remember having that feeling when that story came out.
Yeah, but like to your point though, this wasn't like like a local or an Arab news network. This was like Reuters. This is like a respected.
This is Reuters, British news network. Our friends, those were the guys who were killed. Not some anonymous foreign journalist outlet that we probably would think were just
to be clear, no journalists deserve to be gunned down in cold blood.
Yeah,
nobody
course.
does.
Absolutely not. These are just people who are living their lives, who are put in a circumstance that is absolutely horrible, and they're making human choices that they make. Most of them, the myth that has been pushed on us that that Muslims are inherently violent or more violent than other people is a complete myth and is phony. And even the most Islamist people, most Islamic pious Muslims, do not revert to violence. We're talking about the fringe crazies of society who are resorting to terrorism and who are resorting to the behavior that ISIS does. And I guess the grander point I was trying to make with a difference between the conflation with the Taliban and Afghanistan is, not only are they different ethnicities and countries, the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda mainly being, they're everywhere, they're Muslims from all over the world, but the base of it is Arabs, with people from former Soviet bloc states and even Uyghurs in China joining. But there's Uyghur militants in Afghanistan too, which should make for an interesting conversation, because I'm sure that will be in the narrative.
I want to talk about that later.
Yeah, well, let's put a pen in that and talk about this. But their ideology is different as well. The Taliban ideology. So, I've said this before in another episode, but the Al-Qaeda they're kind of like the radical, kind of like National Socialist, extreme fringe, just crazy radical nut job lunatic. And the Taliban is more like the ultra conservative orthodox type. They only care about what's in front of them, and kind of the world they can imagine in front of them in Afghanistan, and it doesn't really go beyond that.
Right, they're not trying to build a caliphate. They're just trying to exercise Islamic law in their village.
Yeah, they're just trying to exercise Islamic law, and as in their state of Afghanistan.
Still bastards, but different
still bastards.
Different scale of bastard.
Still going into indiscriminately killing villagers and things like that. Still doing awful things. I'm just saying there's no kind of pipe dream of global jihad within the Taliban ranks. That is not something that is core to their ideology, like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or things like that. And even the background, the most of the Taliban and these guys are illiterate. They're come from very, very poor societies. Al-Qaeda now too, though, that is kind of where they recruit from. But the founders of Al-Qaeda were a bunch of rich boys.
Right.
Like Osama bin Laden was the son of a billionaire. Mm-hmm. And Zawahiri, the leader of Islamic Jihad that that united with Osama bin Laden to kind of create the prototype of Al-Qaeda. He was a doctor. He was a famous doctor in Egypt. So, they were these rich boys who, had the sophistication and the money and the connections to travel across the world and to, create these grand plans and, recruit these people. And, they had the resources to pull off these large-scale terrorist attacks.
Here's a good way to put it. The Taliban are like Pinky, and Al-Qaeda are like the brain, in that he's always trying to take over the world. Yeah, I guess that's a good analogy. I think the Taliban are like a bunch of, I don't know, they're like you're just conservatives. That's it. You're conservatives, and then your Al-Qaeda are like your just, whatever extreme you dislike that you want to project on them. If you want to say you're extreme right-wing, alt-right people, or extreme, crazy leftist, whatever suits you. I know people just like to project whatever political opinion on people they hate. Right. Like how they do Hitler. They'll be like, Hitler was a socialist. No, he wasn't. They're like, it was actually left-wing. Right. They'll just project what they don't like on what and say that's what Hitler was. Because, Hitler was obviously a horrible person. All right, move on.
Let's move on. I don't want to get too lost in this point. But to go back to the Taliban and their initial expansion, how they took over Afghanistan, at least how they took over Afghanistan in the 90s. They did this by not even really doing that much fighting. Like, they would go to these other militia groups and these warlords, and I don't know the exact way or how they negotiated these terms and stuff like that, but they would say, hey, something along the lines of going like, hey, listen, we don't want to fight you. We just want you to like be with us and love Allah like us, and we're all Muslim brothers. Why are we doing this? If you join us, we won't kill you, and then if you don't join us, we'll kill you. And that was good enough for them to catch enough momentum and take over pretty much 90% of the country by 1997, including the major cities like Kabul. Mm-hmm. And they didn't destroy Kabul. They never destroyed Kabul. They basically walked in there, and the Northern Alliance was a big fraud. It was a big nothing, and it didn't do anything. And the Taliban was the only real legitimate power because they had the support of the plurality Pashtun population, and that was it. They had the will to have it, and the other kind of tribe groups did not. But now, so my favorite, and Scott Horton put me onto this guy, but he's really good. He's really good and he's really bad at the same time. His name is Bill Roggio, and he's a really good writer. Very good, like, war writer. Very easy to follow. Very fact-based, and explains exactly what's going on. But he's also a war hawk, a huge war hawk. But I recommend reading his stuff. It's called the Long War Journal, and he was writing that, he was saying all this. So and there's a valley called the Panjshir Valley, and a very well-known Mujahideen commander, his son is trying to form a resistance to form up against the Taliban. Ahmed Massoud, his son, his name is Ahmad Shah Massoud. He wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday. We're recording this on Thursday night, and is calling them to resist the Taliban. And he's saying that we need help. So we're already seeing, a bit of a breakup, or not almost a breakup, but we're seeing like some resistance in that form. And Bill Roggio's conclusion is that the White House the media is refusing to really speak about this because they don't want to put they're scared that if there's a will to fight in Afghanistan, then the Pentagon will have to go back, and they'll be forced to go back. And he's kind of laying it out in hawk terms. He's like, well, if we knew that there was a will to fight, the American people would want to go back there.
Right. It goes contrary to what Biden is saying, where they don't want to fight, so why should we fight for them? Right.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and
I get it.
Honestly,
it's also the vice president too. The former current. I don't know what to call him anymore. The guy who was the vice president before Kabul fell. He stuck around in the country even when the president basically abdicated the throne and fucking bounced. And he's in that same area in the Panjshir Valley doing basically the same thing, like trying to organize a resistance. Let's put a pin in the Panjshir Valley because I definitely have some questions about that. But yeah.
All right. So I know that let's try to compare this, like going back to the optics of this. So obviously, the optics are horrible mm-hmm. optics. Is this, when I say best case scenario, I say best case scenario in terms of just like overall destruction in us getting out. But as far as politically, it just didn't look good because, you're not going to know. I mean, most people just don't really know that much about these foreign areas, and I can't really blame them. So a lot of the reaction that I get from normies, so people who are just normal people going about their lives, they see this and they're like, oh, well, what the hell are we doing? Why are we leaving? We should at least leave, keep the status quo there. This is horrible. and like, oh, Biden's this first big mess up. Someone needs to get fired. And I'm sure a lot of people should be fired. But, I'm curious to hear, the comparison that's coming out is like, this is the fall of Saigon. This is the fall of Saigon with people, helicopters. And, they were making that comparison prior, saying, hey, don't worry. When we pull out of Kabul, it's not going to be like the fall of Saigon. There's not going to be people hanging on the helicopters. There's not going to be, they explicitly said, there's not going to be people hanging on helicopters like when we left Saigon.
And there were.
And there were people hanging on the planes.
Well, they weren't wrong about the helicopters, I guess.
The image, the image that was instilled before that video of the plane came out, of the people hanging onto it and stuff like that. There was a picture of
like two of those helicopters.
Yeah, like a helicopter transporting people out of the embassy.
Right.
And that was like the still frame for every single Afghan story.
Right.
And, apparently that's how they transport people in and out of the embassy anyway.
I mean, it's the most efficient way.
Yeah, so I don't know, but that was the image. Like, oh, this is bad.
Right.
Come watch television now. Come on, watch news now. Story. We're leaving war. Get angry, mad.
All right, let me take this part, because I did a lot of research on this particular comparison, and I think where I want to start by saying is that Afghanistan has been going through what appears to be like a civil war for like you said, like 40 years or a million years, whatever, long fucking time, right? And now that the Taliban is basically taking over Afghanistan, you could probably say that this would-be civil war is over, again, for the second time or third. I don't know. I'm losing count here. And then, you pointed out those videos and, earlier of people like desperately trying to flee Kabul and like hanging onto the airplanes and shit. And obviously, people are making those comparisons to the fall of Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War. And actually, in a lot of ways, it's pretty accurate. It's not exactly the same, but it's accurate in many ways. So I wanted to take some time to talk about what happened after the fall of Saigon, to see what other comparisons or even maybe some hypotheses that we can make about Afghanistan's future under the Taliban. So I want to start by saying, like, I've read some pretty good articles on this one, and one thing that I learned was that at the end of the Vietnam War, there was a lot of questions, like difficult questions that were raised specifically by the South, by the people who lost. And those questions were things like what kind of government are we going to have after this? Would the South have like the ability to have like autonomy from the communist North, or would they be like somehow integrated, in some equal way? Will they have equal representation? And also, what's going to happen to all the people that the communists look at as enemies, like, capitalists and, people who are associated with the South Vietnamese government, or, people who are associated with Americans or French backers, And honestly, just those questions alone, you can ask very similar questions about the end of this Afghanistan war. Like, what kind of government are they going to have? Like, I think they're calling themselves right now an Islamic Emirate, whatever that means.
They're going to be an Islamic Emirate,
right? I don't even know what that means.
They're going to have they're going to have Sharia law most likely, and
yeah, but again, really Sharia law is like there are many interpretations of Sharia law and many interpretations of Islam, right? So it's not super clear.
There's a difference between Sharia law in Saudi Arabia and Sharia law in Iran. I mean, they're both not good.
No, neither are good. But
neither are good. But Saudi Arabia's worst.
But the point though is that because of those differences, like, you can make the argument that nobody knows what the hell kind of government this is going to be, because it really just depends on how they decide to interpret Sharia law.
Well, here is the silver lining, and here's where I'll sound a little bit like a Taliban apologist. It certainly seemed like the people in these videos were a younger generation, and I don't know what that's worth.
Let's get back to that. Put a pin in that. I have some stuff to say about that. later. One of the other questions, so going back to the second question from Vietnam, but, will any region of Afghanistan have autonomy from the Taliban? So right now, that Panjshir Valley area that we were just talking about a little while ago, maybe they'll hold some resistance, maybe not. I don't know. Probably not. Let's be real, right? The urban centers are probably not going to,
according to Bill Roggio, they're not most likely going to have a solid resistance, and he has been pretty. As much of a hawk as he is, yeah. Bill Roggio has been 100% accurate about the fall of Kabul and everything that's been going on. So, I mean, I will grant him that, and he said it's most likely not going. He's a legitimate authority on Afghanistan,
right?
Despite some of his conclusions about how foreign policy should be conducted, and he says that they're not.
Well, there you go. But it's still a question, right?
Yeah.
And then the final and probably most important question is, what's going to happen to the people who the Taliban view as enemies? So I'm talking about like Afghanistan military, politicians, U.S. collaborators, activists, women. Probably nothing good, right? I think we can probably both agree that it's not going to be good.
Well, they came out with a statement saying that we will, because, man, I think it was Germany that came out and said we're not going to give foreign aid to, this new government if they implement Sharia law. And they came out and said we will, treat women with as much equity as Islamic law lets you. They said something along the lines of that.
Within the confines of Islamic law. I know it's all talk. And
yeah,
as I go on with this, I think you'll find that a lot of similar talk was had from the North Vietnamese that and it pretty much went away immediately, like the moment that they had an opportunity. So I'll get there. All right, so the fall of Saigon was in 1975, and this was the first step towards reunifying Vietnam. And I'm making a very clear comparison here. Taliban taking over Kabul is literally only the first step of creating a new Afghanistan, a unified, whatever that's going to pan out to be, Islamic Emirate, whatever. But the biggest challenge for Vietnam at the time was the reconciliation of two totally different political cultures and ways of life. And you can make that same exact argument right now. There are obviously the Taliban have a way of thinking. They are a Islamic focused group, both politically, culturally, etc. But for the better part of the last 20 years, maybe less than that, let's call it 10 years, at least the population centers in Afghanistan have been mostly Western, right? Mostly capitalist, even though they're rife with all kinds of, corruption and issues and things like that. It is clear that there is a very big political and social and cultural divide between these two things. So just like in the fall of Saigon, the biggest challenge for Afghanistan, for the Taliban, will be to somehow figure out how to manage these very different political viewpoints. And one thing that was standing in the way of reconciliation in Vietnam was the North Vietnam's very deep suspicion of lots of people in the South and their doubts about their loyalty to communism and the communist regime. And so there was this culture in Vietnam after the war of making Southerners feel like their entire life before 1975 was a crime, and that they needed to be punished for it, or that they needed to atone for some kind of sin, right? Because they were engaging in capitalism, and this was a very prominent thing that was happening immediately after. And you can draw some comparisons kind of already to how an Islamic emirate that's run by the Taliban might view Afghanis who were accustomed to a more, westernized culture as sinners. As an example, already you're seeing shopkeepers painting over their windows, you see a hair salon, right? And on the hair salon and on the windows there's a picture of some woman, and she's not wearing a hijab or anything like that because it's a fucking hair salon, and they're painting over the images because that's the Taliban, an Islamic run dictatorship, basically, would obviously view that as sin, right? That is haram. That is not good. So we're already seeing this, that there's going to be very likely a culture imposed from the Taliban onto people specifically in those population centers, that their lives before the Taliban rule is sin.
Oh, well, yeah, of course. I mean, in Saudi, just look at Saudi Arabia, and if you go to I was watching this documentary by DWS. Mm-hmm. That's the German network, right?
Deutsche Welle, yeah.
They did a really good documentary on women in Saudi Arabia, mm-hmm. and they do a couple of good documentaries, but they show the part where they went into a mattress store, and the mattress store blurred out the female models, mm-hmm. because they were not wearing masks,
right?
Or because they were near a bed. I forget the reason or what law it violated, but they
doesn't
were
matter what the reason
blurred
is.
out.
Just
like
it was, yeah.
So yeah, they'll probably implement conservative things like that, and they mm-hmm. won't be friendly to homosexuals or gay people
or activists.
Yeah, I'm sure they will not have progressive views.
No, and in order to do that, they're going to have to impose a forced assimilation on lots and lots of people. And in the North, in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese government's approach to doing this, to like creating loyalty to communism, was often brutal. And what it ended up doing is alienating a lot of people rather than winning them over, right? They're not going to, win over, the educated women of Kabul who are, pursuing an advanced degree by forcing them to wear a burqa and maybe not go to school anymore, right? That's just, that's not going to be, it's not going to be received well, right? And so you can make that argument that the Taliban are probably going to follow a very similar path as the North Vietnamese did in forcing Afghanis to assimilate to the Islamic Emirate.
Well, can I throw a peg in there?
Sure.
Or a rock in there?
Yeah.
So here's I think a key point. Even though the Taliban control the country right now, and it's been days now, so we have I have no business trying to. I'm obviously not an expert in this at all, so I have no. Any prediction I make doesn't really matter. However, the Taliban they essentially became the occupied to the occupier in Kabul. So I don't think it's going to be easy for them to enforce hardcore Sharia in these urban centers, because I think that's just a recipe for creating a lot of resentment if they're going to do that. So I think that they're a little bit more rational than that, and I don't think they're going to go that hardcore. Maybe they'll have some areas where there's a little bit more autonomy, where they can practice more Western type values, because I think that will be a recipe of disaster if they just immediately take every woman and treat them like they do in Saudi Arabia. I will say though, outside of I almost said Palestine, outside of Kabul, in the rural area, because they're countryside. It's kind of like the equivalence if a bunch of people from Kentucky and West Virginia and the rural Pennsylvania all just took over New York, and they're like, okay, or took over Washington D.C. We got the government now. You know what I mean? We got the guns. We're the force to be reckoned with. Yeah, they may be the monopoly on violence, but they won't be they won't be for long if they start imposing a lot of very restrictive things on society that does not want them. So I think that
You're
they
right.
understand that there's a fine line.
You're right, but like let me tell you more about Vietnam, because I think the North Vietnamese understood this very well. It would have been easier for them to control rural areas than it would be, Saigon, as an example. And so the North understood that in order to, the thing is though that the North wasn't just going to be like, oh well, I guess we can't impose communism on fucking Saigon because, it would create a lot of resentment and it would be bad for us. No, they don't stop there. People who are power hungry and, are going to immediately do everything they can to consolidate political control. And that's exactly what they did, because they needed to consolidate political control in the South in order to what they would call unify the country. And some steps that they did to do this were eliminating potential rivals, re-educating people who were suspected of disloyalty, and preventing other ideologies and beliefs from competing with socialism. And I want to break those down. So the first one, becoming the rivals. Okay, so in '73, right, this is before the fall of Saigon here, there was these Paris Peace Accords. It was just obviously a set of negotiations that tried to end the conflict. According to those peace accords, the South Vietnam was supposed to continue as a separate and sovereign state until the North and the South could agree upon how would Vietnam look via elections or negotiations, right? And the North agreed to this and the South agreed to this. But quickly after 75, when everyone pulled out, they reneged on this deal real fast, like super duper fast, right? So I want to make a comparison real fast to, how the Taliban right now are saying, hey, don't worry about it. If you're going to school, go back to school. If you got a job, go to do your job. They're saying that now, but the North Vietnamese were saying the same shit before, right? They were saying, oh, don't worry about it. We're not going to communize the South immediately. Like, we'll figure it out later, right? And pretty much the moment, within a year of the U.S. pulling out of Saigon, there was a meeting of the North and South leadership, and a decision was made to merge the two Vietnams into a single state, and they called this the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And let me be very clear about this decision. It was not a debate. It was not a consensus. The North did this despite the Southern's, leadership's objections to this. They just did it, right? And the South of Vietnam had no say in this process in reunifying. And much like how, the Taliban is going to unilaterally reunite Afghanistan, they're not gonna like go to the negotiating table with like the former heads of state of the Afghanistan democracy and be like, hey, let's figure out how to make a country that works for both of us. No, they're very clear about what they want. They want an Islamic emirate in the entirety of Afghanistan, and that's that. There is no room for the former democratic leaders. They're not going to play a part in the emirate, So just immediately, I think we should not take what they're saying, what the Taliban is saying right now, with a heavy grain of salt, like the whole fucking, a whole salt mine's worth of it. Let's talk about the second thing, or unless you had a comment on that.
So listen, I understand. I obviously wouldn't take what they say, or I'll take what they say with a grain of salt. However, I think the difference between Afghanistan and Vietnam is that, these people don't even. A lot of the people in South Vietnam were migrants from North Vietnam, escaping. Escaping communism or being coerced.
I could say the same things about the city centers in Afghanistan. A lot of people were escaping the rural areas where there was a lot of fucking warlords and unrest. Even your run-of-the-mill military people were escaping to the city centers.
But in Afghanistan, all these are, it's very ethnically driven and language driven, and it's ethnic. There are different ethnicities that are dividing the country essentially. Like the Pashtuns, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Hazaras. Like the Northern Alliance are basically everyone who's not Pashtun kind of ganged up together to.
And the Taliban doesn't give a fuck, right? The Taliban,
I don't think that the Taliban have the capability to pull that off. So I think they're kind of forced to they're going to be kind of forced to be a little bit more tolerant than they normally would be. And another reason is because in the 90s the US let this happen because hey, like our allies kind of like them. Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, like the Taliban. Bill Clinton was like, hey, I think these guys can develop into another Saudi Arabia. That won't be too bad. So, we weren't really in bad terms. And now we live in a unipolar world. Like, the United States is, at this moment, I don't think it's going to be like this forever, but is the power of the world. And, it has the ability to coerce countries into behaving certain ways through aid spigots and things like that, and other countries typically go along with that. You just saw Germany say, hey, if you implement Sharia law, we're going to end our foreign aid. I think there's a way to dangle the carrot in front of them and say, hey, listen, you have to become normal, or we're just not going to deal with you. You're not going to have entrance into this global economy, and you're going to be a poverty-stricken poorhouse, and that's not going to last very long for your regime if you're completely in poverty.
I'm telling you, man. I'm telling you, this has just been there, read that.
But in Vietnam's case, it was
the same.
They had the Soviet Union.
The same sentiments were happening in Vietnam. They were the international community, specifically the United States, was. They placed an embargo on Vietnam for a while after they pulled out, and were saying, "Hey, we're not going to give you any aid if you guys are dicks to the South." But they still did it anyway. And I'll go back to my point that the Taliban do not give a fuck about all of the other ethnics and cultures and societies that are within Afghanistan. All they care about is creating one unified Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan, and that's it. And they don't care, and I bet that they'll do everything in their power to do so. And I think they're tracking just like the North Vietnamese did when they reunified the two Vietnams. And remember, one of the conditions, one of the things that they're doing in Afghanistan, the Taliban are straight up saying, okay, cool, just lay down your weapons and we won't kill you, and you guys can go about your business, and we're not going to change anything. They have the means to force people to do whatever the fuck they want, because they definitely have they have the, as you say, the monopoly on violence, right? As a condition of sweeping all of these many provinces in Afghanistan, the largest, most impactful part of this is that they're de-weaponizing the population centers. So they have no means to resist in that respect. And so here's another way that North Vietnam imposed themselves on the South, and it was through re-education. And it was a big priority for the North because, and by re-education, of course, I mean brainwashing, because they needed to assimilate people to their new government. And what was tricky about this is that the new government couldn't just totally replace or kill everyone in the South who had, experience, doing things like running boring parts of the country, right? That would be a disaster. But they set up these programs to try to re-educate them so that they can, keep the people that were necessary doing what they were doing, and also try and, quell any dissent. So a lot of low and mid-level kind of like civil servants in the old South Vietnamese government they ended up being replaced by northern officials. And I'm not talking about political servants, like politics and stuff. I'm talking about like people who ran schools and hospitals and utilities and things like that. And those folks basically got sent away to camps for a few days or a few weeks to go through these like retraining courses. So, communist brainwashing basically. But the point I'm making here is that they were able to replace a lot of them from the north. The Taliban is mostly a bunch of young men who are like warlords. A lot of them probably even illiterate, so they don't have the luxury of being able to replace these people. So the best they can do is like enforce some kind of like Sharia law training camp, which I imagine that this is totally probable. They're gonna need to, if they're serious about exercising a Sharia law and an Islamic emirate in Afghanistan, they're gonna need to set up a program of forceful brainwashing for a lot of people. But in Vietnam, like people like high-ranking officials and soldiers and stuff like that, their re-education was a lot longer and a lot more severe. Some people spent years in camps. They were tortured. They were forced to do hard labor. Some were taken away and they were just never seen again. In total, about 1 million people in the former South Vietnam were subjected to some kind of re-education. And it makes you think about how the Taliban might also go through that same type of re-education for millions of people in Afghanistan who, like I said before, spent the better part of like 20 years in urban city centers with a more or less Western lifestyle. If they're serious about about enforcing Sharia law, this is what they would probably do. I also want to tell you a little bit about the demographics here, because keep in mind, 46% of Afghanis are under the age of 15. That's almost half of their entire country. Weren't even born when the beginning of the war started. So the full demographics are 0 to 14 is 40%, 15 to 24 is 21%, 25 to 54 is 31%, and then it drops off a fucking cliff. There's 55 to 64 is 4%, and there's little under 3% are 65 and older. So we're talking about, if we go from like 0 to 24, we're talking about like 62, 63% of the entire population who, have grown up and have been raised in, what you can argue to be a quasi-Western society. So if the Taliban are going to hold on to any of the ideas of making an Islamic, emirate, they're going to need to do a lot of re-education. And North Vietnam had the monopoly on violence, and they were able to force people to do it. I can imagine that the Taliban would be able to do so as well.
I think a big difference, though, is that North Vietnam had like a legitimately fucking huge, like really big army rolling through. A better trained army than the Taliban. They're a more formidable foe than the Taliban is right now. I get it. I understand that. I think if the Taliban were to pull anything like that off, like a re-education thing, it would just mean funding madrasas, and they would have to be heavily financed by Pakistan as well as Saudi Arabia, which probably will happen or could happen. It's going to be interesting to see what China's relationship will be, because they have I think their major incentive. I don't want to go too off. Should I put the pen in this? I don't want to go.
Yeah,
too
I think so, because I definitely want to talk about China and the Uyghurs and stuff like that. But
okay.
Last little bit about this. So they had this basically in Vietnam. They had this a tool to identify what they called, quote, bad elements. So people who are opposed to communism. And it was called a personal dossier, which were they would have people write up like a biography of themselves, which was like, what's your name, what are the names of your family, what's your ethnicity, what's your religious affiliation, what do you do for a living, what do your and then like permutations of that. And they used this information to categorize people, right? So good or bad. And obviously, if you worked for the French or the Americans, you were bad. If If you owned a business, you're a capitalist, and therefore you're bad. If you fought against the U.S., you're good, and so on and so forth, right? And you can imagine that the good people got better perks than the bad ones. In total, I think something like a third of the South's population were believed to be in the bad category. So it really sucked for a lot of the people in Vietnam then. But I gotta say, I don't think that the Taliban have the capacity to force people to, write personal dossiers about everyone and then process all that information to figure out who's good and who's bad. But I can see some
70% of the population can't write.
Exactly. But what I can see though, and this is a thing almost everywhere, right? Like almost everywhere. I can see them setting up some kind of rudimentary form of snitching, right? Where the Taliban would just have people snitch on each other and say, oh, they're Western supporters, or they're haram or some shit like that, right? And the real question is whether they'd see, all right, cool, somebody snitched on you, what happens, right? Are they going to try to re-educate you, or are they going to straight up kill you? And that's what we're already seeing this now, right? Like we're already seeing people like selling out their maybe not their family, maybe even their family shit, but like selling out their neighbors and shit like that to try and get a leg up with the Taliban. Be like, oh yeah, they were in the army or something like that. They were an American collaborator. We're already seeing reports of this happening now. Couple other things. The communist government in Vietnam was obviously an authoritarian regime. And I mean, from the looks of it, I'd imagine that the Taliban is going to be authoritarian as well. So you can imagine a lot of institutions will probably be taken under the Taliban control, just like they were in Vietnam. So in Vietnam, things like media, schools, religious institutions, shit like that, all of that was brought under government control because they were all a threat to their ideology, right? You can't have people learning how democracy works or have people criticizing the government in the paper, so they shut down newspapers. They, started keeping records of who was going to religious services. They also burned books and shit that weren't supportive of the revolution, which, once you start seeing books burned, it's just a bad sign. And, they started swapping out teachers from the South to the North. Now, I could see the Taliban taking over the news media pretty easily, and I think they're kind of already are, right? I mean, they're holding press conferences and shit, right? So I think that they've got that on lock. But the makeup of the Taliban, like I said before, is just mostly young men, uneducated men at that. So I'm not entirely sure how they would replace things like teachers. I think that would be very difficult for them to do. If they were to do anything, they would just try, as you said, to force people into these madrasas, and they would need probably outside help to get those funded. But if they were to succeed in that, that would be absolutely disastrous for the future economy, and more so for the kids. Remember, 45% of them are under the age of 15. So there's that. Now, I could talk a bit more. We're running a little bit long. I can summarize a few additional points. Big differences between Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Taliban is that obviously the Vietnamese are a communist regime, and they basically communized the entire economy. So they confiscated all private property and they nationalized every business, and it backfired really quickly, because things like collectivizing farmers and not really having incentives on production, caused everything to fall rapidly, so much so that they were in a famine. That's probably not going to happen with the Taliban because they're obviously not communists in that respect. But something tells me that the Taliban aren't exactly the right people for the job of running a government. I think they're probably the perfect people to take over a government, but actually doing the work of governance is a different story. And I think the warlord nature of Afghanis suggests to me that, if anything, the economy is just going to be run like a runaway oligarchy, right? So, it's unfortunate, but going from straight up capitalism, or kind of capitalism in Afghanistan today, to some kind of half-baked system, like, handshake, backroom deal, warlord shit, is definitely going to have negative implications on the economy, which is I mean, I just think that's inevitable, unfortunately. So different in the sense that they will be different economic things, but the same in the sense that you'd be replacing capitalism with something stupid.
I think here's our disconnect right now. Afghanistan is like barely a state at all anyway. Like, there's a couple of urban centers, and there's the borders that were drawn, and the urban centers are just almost completely removed from the country. Like, they're just different worlds. And I don't think the Taliban have the capability to run this mass propaganda campaign to coerce people. I just don't think they have the ability or the incentive to do it. I think that they are going to kind of be forced to be a little bit more tolerant than they were. I'm not going to say they're going to be tolerant. I'm just saying that relative to what they were, I think they're going to have to do that, just based off what I've seen. I don't know how much stock you could put into this, but just the fact that a lot of the guys are younger and they have cell phones and stuff like that. It could be a younger generation type thing, which is more willing to, who's maybe kind of more removed from the old ways. Something about society in Afghanistan, man, there's pockets in the rural country, like the old, like, ancient Pashtun codes that are like way more, backwards than, or just old school than anything that even Saudi Arabia teaches, or Saudi Arabian madrasas teaches, like, where they basically say that women are like they treat women like livestock. So compared to that, the Taliban are to the left. I guess we're talking about the urban centers right now.
We are, and to be clear, to be clear, I kind of see where your point is. It is true that the population centers or the demographics of Afghanistan skews heavily towards rural than it does in major urban centers like Kabul. However, I will say that major urban centers like Kabul are the epicenters of wealth in Afghanistan, if you can consider anything about Afghanistan wealthy, right? They're what produces any yields, unless they're gonna straight up just go back to just selling fucking heroin and poppy and shit. That's where all their money's coming from. And it would be naive, I think, to think that the Taliban are just going to ignore the urban centers. That's where the money is. That's where all the infrastructure comes from. You're right. A lot of these Taliban fighters are young kids, and they got cell phones and stuff like that. They want modern shit too. They want internet and they want all this stuff. So I think it's a little short-sighted to think that they're just going to ignore the major population centers. I think they're going to want to dominate the major population centers. They're going to want to control them to the best of their ability, because that's where they're going to get the most money, and that's also where they're going to get the most international notoriety, because remember, they need to be accepted by the world community if they're going to succeed. I don't think they're going to ignore it. And the only way that they can have their cake and eat it too is to just brutalize people. I mean, North Vietnam could have been the same way. They could have just been like, yeah, fuck Saigon. We're just going to dominate the rest of the land and just leave them alone. No, that's not what they did. They wanted communism everywhere. Same thing with the Taliban. They want an Islamic emirate everywhere. And they're not going to ignore the major population centers.
Well, I guess we'll see. We'll see how this this government acts and behaves, or how long it behaves. It's there's so many questions to be asked about what's going to happen right now, and I guess time will only tell as things fold out over the next year or so.
I got some last bits before we shut down for the day, and that's the refugee crises, because there are some parallels to Vietnam. In Vietnam, there was something like 140,000 Southerners who fled the country in '75. Most of them were people who worked with Americans, and they permanently resettled in the United States. And with some luck, maybe a lot of people from Afghanistan will have the same ability, but that it didn't stop there. I mean, there was an international crisis in Vietnam where something like in '77 there was like 15,000 Vietnamese. They called them boat people, who were just getting on these rickety ass boats and like trying to go to other Southeast Asian countries. A lot of them were turned away, and this quadrupled by the end of the following year to like 62,000 people that were literally fleeing the South. And we already see today that thousands of Afghanis are trying to leave the country. It's going to be the same, if not worse, in Vietnam. And this could trigger a refugee crisis, which can result in regional instability and maybe even some more war. And I think what's interesting about this is all of the regional players, right? So there is Pakistan for obvious reasons. There's some trepidation in Pakistan because their president literally was on this ABC interview that I watched not too long ago, and he was straight up saying like, "Hey, we've had a rough go of it for the last couple of years. Our economy kind of sucks right now. We cannot take more refugees, but this is going to happen whether he likes it or not." And a lot of people are probably going to go into areas that are Pashtun in Pakistan. There's a big chunk of Western Pakistan that's also Pashtun. There is some also hesitations about what if the Taliban decide that they want to annex that, or what if they want to somehow exercise some control over that. What if they start convincing Pashtuni people to take over Pakistan, and kind of expand that way. Those are very real trepidations. I know Turkey is kind of the end point, the landing point for a lot of Afghanis who are leaving Afghanistan. Now, that's not the first country they go to, because Turkey and Pakistan and Afghanistan don't border one another, but they go to Turkey vis-a-vis other countries, places like Uzbekistan and things like that. And Turkey's already having a fucking problem with refugees. We've talked about this with the Syrian crises, and they don't want any more. Like they don't need any more, but ultimately that's where a lot of people are saying that they're going, and where a lot of people are already going. So there's that. They'd have to somehow get involved. And then there's China. And this is a big one, because the, Xinjiang province, Uyghur population, a lot of them are Islamic, right? A lot of them are Muslim. And a lot of people are going to be going to, or at least thinking to go in that direction towards Xinjiang and similar areas. That is inherently a problem for China, because they're already I don't want to use the word genocide again, but they're already doing some fucked up things to the Uyghurs there. And China, needs Afghanistan to chill the fuck out if they want to do their Belt and Road Initiative, right? And we can't have a massive refugee crisis in Central Asia, or at least China doesn't want this, because that disrupts their plans, that disrupts their business.
I think a lot of China's concerns right now are about the Uyghur, the Uyghur militants that are there. There's a lot of Uyghur militants in Afghanistan, and I think that their policy is going to focus on that primarily. They're going to say, hey, Taliban, we'll treat you normal, just like if you see a Uyghur militant, just kill him. And we'll be cool. I think that's what their policy is going to be. Like, just do not foster the weaker militants, and we'll be straight. And as far as this mining stuff, there's all this, everyone's reporting on like, oh, there's trillions of dollars of mineral wealth underneath Afghanistan that China's going to get. They're like, oh no. Dude, everyone's known there's been this, like, they have a lot of like different minerals there. What do you think's gonna happen? They're just gonna come in with like a bunch of cranes and just start staking it and stealing it? Like China's going to invade Afghanistan or something like that and start stealing the mineral wealth?
No, but it can turn into like an African country where the dictators there enrich themselves personally and sell off the rights to mine there. That's a very real thing. China has experience.
China's going to kill them. China is in the process of killing themselves with their monetary policy, and that is, they can do that, and they can issue these predatory loans like they do to Africa, and they can build these projects, and they can fund these projects that they will obviously not get their money back on. And do this stupid shit and then say, hey, we're going to take that port or we're going to take that mining facility. But then I don't think they even have the real means to say, hey, all right, like, you didn't pay back my loan. I have control over that port. And doing that to the Taliban, they'll just be like, okay, fuck you, go to hell. Like, they're not going to be able to enforce that type of will over there. And I don't think they're going to be engaging in that predatory system that they do. And I ultimately think that predatory loan system that they're using right now is going to really hurt them in the long run. I think China is creating a lot of self-inflicted wounds right now with their own monetary policy. I think they have fallen away from a lot of the good market transitions they made in the 1980s, and they're falling back into a lot of the bad practices that they were doing prior to when they're having their reforms in their economy. But I think, yeah, if they want to have a presence in Afghanistan, go ahead. Like,
I mean, can you at least acknowledge the fact that a refugee crisis would cause?
Oh yeah, there's going to be a refugee crisis. I can absolutely acknowledge that. There's going to be a refugee crisis, and I think America definitely has an obligation to take collaborators. I think I said that in the beginning of the episode.
Mm-hmm.
to take people that are going to get killed, frankly, because there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be killed if they don't leave. So the U.S. absolutely has the obligation to take those people in and make sure they don't get killed, like translators, interpreters, and things like that. It goes without saying. But yeah, there's going to be a refugee crisis. There was a big refugee crisis in the early 90s too. A lot of European countries, a lot of Afghans from European countries are from those, from that era.
I think what's unfortunate about today is that countries all over the world right now are kind of burnt out on refugee crises. Nobody's willing to take refugees anymore. So many major Western countries are turning people away left and right. I mean, we are probably the biggest culprit of this.
Yeah, we're not. It's a difficult situation because there's no doubt issues. Man, this is a whole nother topic. I don't want to get too far into the refugee debate, but these refugee, like, I just think it goes all from where it started. Like, there wouldn't be these refugee crises if there weren't these wars that were being created largely by Western powers.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong. However, that's reductive, right? It doesn't matter what should have happened or what shouldn't have happened. What matters is what's happening right now. You're not wrong. Well, we shouldn't have gone into Afghanistan in the first place, or at least we shouldn't have thought to nation build there. But we did. That's already done. It's in the past, and now these are the consequences that we have to wrestle with. And there will be some regional instability. Again, to make very clear, doesn't mean that we should have stayed. It doesn't mean that we should go back in. I'm just putting forth the challenges that the world, and specifically that region, is going to have to deal with. And what's important to think about this is, how do the players in that region react to those challenges? How do they meet those challenges? And we can be overly optimistic about the Taliban just kind of doing a laissez-faire play and saying maybe women have to wear burqas, but for the most part everything will go back to normal, and maybe that's the best case scenario for that. But as far as my interpretation of the comparison between the fall of Saigon and our current fall of Kabul, it seems like the Taliban are tracking much in the same way as the North Vietnamese did. And I don't believe right now, I have no reason to believe that the Taliban are going to do anything any differently.
All right. See, I think we're going to have to, for now, just agree to disagree. I think the circumstances are just a lot different, and they're completely different societies, and Islamic law and communism, and they're different animals altogether. But maybe we can kind of discuss this as things play out, because we're dealing with limited information right now.
For sure.
But we're going on almost 2 hours right now. I think it's time to end today's episode, today's session.
Agreed.
We're all out of time. I'm watching The Sopranos right now, and it's like, watching the dynamics between Melfi and Tony. We're all out of time now. All right, you want to end this?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks again for listening to another episode of Bro History. It has been a pleasure doing this episode for you all. Make sure that you rate and review the podcast. That is the number one way to support our show. Is going over to the top right, where the rating review section is on Apple iPad, and rating and reviewing the podcast. Give it a 5-star. And then you can also join us on Patreon, get access to our Slack. Make sure you tune in to our episodes weekly. We discuss history, current politics, international politics, and a whole bunch of other stuff that we find interesting. Anything else to add?
No, man. Peace.
All right. See you guys.
Okay.